Run. Okay. So picking up where we left off before lunch. Thank you. Picking up where we left off before lunch. Chapter 12 is property management. So this is the natural follow-up to landlord and tenant. So now we're going to take those landlord-tenant laws and apply them to us as brokers, where we would be property managers. So a couple of things you need to know about property management in North Carolina. And if you're the property manager, again, who would you be representing in the transaction? The landlord or the tenant? The landlord. You'd be on the landlord side. A couple of things to remember about property managers in North Carolina. Number one, notice it says only non-provisional brokers can be engaged as property managers. Only non-provisional brokers can be property managers in North Carolina. There's very few things that a provisional broker cannot do. I mean, if you think back about all that, that list of things that a provisional broker can do. Can a provisional broker help buy and sell property? Yes. Can a provisional broker be a dual agent? Yes. Can a provisional broker be a designated dual agent? Yes, except against who? Their bid. Okay? So pretty much anything can be done by a provisional broker, except property management. This is the first. There's only 2 exceptions on that list, and we'll talk about the other one, which is a broker price opinion later. But property management cannot be done by provisional brokers. This is completely the domain of non-provisional brokers. Now, that does not mean that provisional brokers can't do property management tasks, because the truth is, a lot of the tasks of the property manager don't require a license at all, as long as that person is a salaried employee of the property manager. Does that make sense for everybody? So a provisional broker could be doing some of these tasks, but they would have to be doing them as the employee of who? Of the property owner, or the employee of who else? Who else could employ them? The property manager, which would be a non-provisional broker. Does that make sense for everybody? So what we mean when we say only non-provisional brokers can do property management is only non-provisional brokers can be the property manager, the one making the decisions. And that's the key phrase here. It's making decisions. If you go back to chapter 7, the agency chapter, we introduced that there was 3 main categories of agency relationships. We said there was special agency, general agency, and universal agency. You guys remember that?
Yes.
And we said that sales agents were what? Special agents. And sales agents or special agents have what kind of decision-making authority? None. They don't get to make any decisions. We said that that's where you are most of the time as a real estate broker. Well, here's the remainder of the time. When you are a property manager, you're not a special agent, you are a what? A general agent. And the reason is that you have some decision-making authority. You have pretty big decision-making authority as far as this property goes. Who's going to decide what tenant to accept? Property manager. Who's going to decide how much to charge for rent? The property manager. Who's going to decide on maintenance issues? The property manager. And so there's lots of decision making that goes into being a property manager. Does it then make sense that we wouldn't want to give that kind of authority to a provisional broker?
No.
That's why we've got that rule there. The definition here says it's a property manager is somebody who preserves the value of the property while generating an income or the highest possible return on investment for the owner. So on a test, you're going to probably see a question that deals with what is a property manager? What's the job of a property manager? You're looking for the definition that combines 2 things. What are those 2 things?
Preserves the value.
Preserves the value, so maintains the value of the property. And what's the second one? Generate highest and best return. Generates the best possible return on investment, which means the most possible what? Money. The return is the money. It's the money that's being generated. The cash that's being generated on the property is the owner's return on investment. We're going to talk about lots of different ways of accounting. Pretty much this chapter is an accounting chapter. Property management is all about accounting back to the landlord for how much money came in, what we did with that money, and then here's the money that's left over. Because you're turning what's left over to the landlord. That's the money they get at the end of the month or quarter or year, depending on how you're reporting to them. One of the main things you have to deduct from that money before you turn it back over to the landlord are what we call operating expenses. So this slide gives you an example of some of the more common types of operating expenses that you're going to account for as a property manager. Things like property taxes. The property taxes on the property are an operating expense. Any maintenance fees, those are an operating expense of the property. Salaries, marketing costs, utilities, property management fees themselves. Those are all, especially this one down here at the bottom, the property management fee. Don't forget to pay yourself. And that is an operating expense. All of these fall under that big category of operating expenses. You need to start to memorize this list because later on you're going to have to start grouping things that are operating expenses in these math questions. And guess what? It's going to be these things. So you have to know. Now, what do you not see on this list as an operating expense? Shannon mentioned it earlier. Your mortgage payment. Do you see mortgage payment on there? No. So what does that tell you about the mortgage payment? It's not an operating expense. A mortgage payment is an ownership expense, not an operating expense. Here's the reason for that. When you're accounting for managing a property, it should not make a difference whether the owner owns it with a loan or without a loan. The property generates whatever income the property generates. Does that make sense? Now, of course, it matters to the owner that they have to have enough money left over to pay that mortgage, but from a management perspective, we manage the property exactly the same whether it has a mortgage on it or not. Is everybody following me on that? And for that reason, we don't count the mortgage itself. We call it debt service is the name of that payment. It's the mortgage interest and principal combined. Principal and interest payment on the mortgage is called debt service. That is not an operating expense. Now, property management agreements, just like every other area of real estate, you can only get paid if you have some type of an agency agreement. Now, what kind of agency agreement do you have with sellers? What do we call that agreement?
Exclusive listing.
A listing agreement, right? It could be an exclusive listing agreement. It could be an exclusive right to sell listing, but it's going to be a listing agreement of some type. What do we call the agency agreement that we have with buyers?
A buyer.
A buyer agency agreement. What do we call the agency agreement that we have with landlords? That would be a property management agreement. A property management agreement is an agency agreement that you have with a landlord. What's the purpose of every agency agreement? Get the real estate firm what? Paid. It's a compensation agreement. So why do we need a property management agreement with this owner? So we can get what?
Paid.
So we can get paid. So what do you think all the things this thing's going to talk about first are?
Money.
Money and how we get paid and how much we get paid. Is it some flat fee or is it some percentage of the rent? What do you think is most likely going to be the case?
Percentage.
Percentage of what? Of percentage of the rent we collected. Not of rent that we might have collected or rent that we should have collected or rent that we hope to collect. It's a percentage of the rent that actually what? Got collected. Think of it this way. Would you really expect an owner to pay you for rent that you didn't collect? That's pretty crazy, doesn't it? So to incentivize you to collect the rent, your compensation is based on rent that you what? Collect. If you don't collect the rent, guess what? You don't get paid. Simple as that. So most property management agreements are going to be some percentage of rent collected. That's going to be by far the most common type of compensation agreement on a property management agreement. This is very different. This bullet point down here, the third major bullet point down, is very different than other agency agreements. Right there it says what? We should have a termination date, but what? But it can have an automatic renewal. Is that different than a listing agreement?
Yes.
Is that different than a buyer agency agreement? Absolutely. In listing agreements and buyer agency agreements, what happens when they get to their expiration date? They're dead. They're dead. Property management agreements don't work that way, and they don't work that way not to protect you and not to protect the landlord. They don't work that way in order to protect the tenant. Think of the tenant's perspective. Who is their contact for everything? The property manager. Who do they pay the rent to? The property manager. Who do they call when they have a maintenance issue? Property manager. Who do they call when somebody mugs them in the parking lot after they call the police? The property manager. All of that goes to the property manager. What if the property management agreement expires and the tenant has no idea who to call? Would that be a bad situation? Absolutely. So, for that reason, property management agreements don't just expire in that way. When you are the property manager, you have to take responsibility for passing that torch along to whoever is going to manage the property after you. You can't just walk away and say, oh, our agreement's over. It doesn't work that way. You're not allowed to do that. You have to notify the tenants that you're no longer going to be the property manager. You have to notify the tenants of who the new property manager is going to be. And what if the landlord doesn't give you the name of who the new property manager is going to be? So who do you notify the tenants to contact? The landlord themselves. The landlord themselves. But you've got to make sure that transition happens. You can't just walk away from this thing at the end, and that's why it could automatically renew itself. A couple of other things. It should say what duties, responsibilities the property manager has. Give me some common things the property manager would be expected to do. Collect rent. What else?
Maintain the property.
Maintain the property, so do maintenance. Make decisions about what maintenance to do and when. What else?
Rent the apartment house, or try to maintain the full house.
Try to maintain the right vacancy levels. Yeah. How about marketing the property?
Yeah.
How about choosing tenants? Yeah. All of those are generally speaking. How about all those summary ejectment proceedings, those court proceedings? Who would be responsible for handling those? The property manager. So a property management agreement should specify everything that the property manager is going to be legally responsible for. Those are very common ones that they are. So much of doing property management is about creating a plan. You should always submit a management plan at the beginning of every year to the owner of the property. It shows them how you plan to manage that property, what your goals are for the property. Should you also have a discussion with the owner about what their goals are for the property? Yeah, like what kind of goals do they have probably for the property?
Sell it.
Well, they might want to sell it. What else? Maybe they want to do upgrades. What else? What other kind of goals? Y'all aren't thinking like investors yet. Somebody said money. That's their goal. Their goal for the property is how much what? Money, return on investment they want to see. That's the only goal they're going to want to talk to you about, folks. If you don't like feeling like a dollar sign, don't go into property management. They don't like you. They don't want to like you. They don't want the tenants to like you. They see you as a dollar sign. The only reason you're there is because they feel like with you there they can get more what? More dollars. That's it. It's the only reason you're around as a property manager. So when you put together a management plan and you talk to them about their goals and objectives for the property, the first goal is for them is going to be how much of a return on investment. How much cash do they get back out of this thing at the end of the year? Are you always going to be able to meet those goals? No, because a lot of times they're not realistic. Because a lot of times the only way you could get that kind of return is with doing no maintenance on the property, and we know that's not reasonable. But you do need to talk to them about their goals. Look at what the vacancy rates are in the area. Look at what your competition is. Those are all things that should go into your management plan. Other thing that you should do for the owner of the property, and this gets to the money part of it, which is really the meat of this chapter. Plan for the money. Show them what you expect the money to look like for the upcoming year. That is called an operating budget. You do a budget in advance. you do a report in arrears. So you do a budget before the year begins. When would you provide a cash flow report to the owner of the property?
At the end of the year.
At the end of the year. So the budget is what you expect will happen. The cash flow report is what? What actually happened. What actually happened. Hopefully you meet or exceed your budget estimate with your cash flow report. So at the beginning of the year or before the year starts, you're going to provide an operating budget. So what things do you think would be projected on an operating budget?
The operating expenses.
Operating expenses, what else? What about, that's money going out. What about money coming in?
The rent.
We project how much rent we expect to collect, how much we expect to pay out in expenses. Do those make sense? Could we project revenue based on that?
Yes.
Can we come back at the end of the year and provide a report, a cash flow report that details that revenue?
Yes.
Absolutely. So make sure you know the difference between an operating budget being a prediction and a cash flow report being what actually happened. And that does bring us to the math of this chapter. This formula is in your formula packet. This formula, in particular, is going to be your best friend for the remainder of the class. You must memorize it. And when I say memorize it, I don't mean halfway. I mean every word, every letter. You have to know it. You have to be able to do this thing in your sleep, forwards and backwards, because every single piece of math you see for the remainder of the class about an investment property is going to involve this formula. So here, before you go down the rabbit hole of, oh my God, it's math, let me just point out, this is the simplest math in the world. It is how much money comes in at the top, and then how much money is left over at the bottom. That's all this is. It's an accounting report. It shows money in and money what? Out. So what do you think the number at the bottom is going to be? Smaller or larger than the number at the top? Much smaller. See, we start this thing with something called gross potential income. Now, how does it describe gross potential income right there?
All the money that.
It says the maximum amount of rent that what? That you could ever possibly hope to collect. Folks, this is fantasy land. This is like you meeting your potential. Nobody does, right? Well, none of us live up to our potential. Potential is something we hope to get there, but we always fall short. So gross potential income is if every unit of this property is occupied for the entire 12 months of the year, and everybody has done what on time for those 12 months? Paid their rent. That is fantasy land. Unless you're managing 2 properties, then you might end up with 100% occupancy and everybody paying on time. But if you're managing 100 properties, what are the odds that they are all occupied and everybody is paying on time? Very low. Because even if you manage to collect all the rent on time, are there not going to be down months where you have people go in and out? You have somebody come out and it takes a month and a half to get somebody in. So you're going to lose some potential income. Does that make sense for everybody? We don't care about those losses up here on the top line. On the top line, it's whatever the maximum we could possibly collect. And what do we call that again? Gross what? Potential income. So you need to memorize that phrase, gross potential income. Because they're going to use these labels in the test questions, and if you don't know the labels, you won't know where you are in the formula. Does that make sense for everybody? So gross potential income is the top line number. It's the max amount you could possibly collect. Now we're going to correct. We're going to first subtract the money that we did not collect. We call that vacancy. Sometimes we call it collection losses. Collection losses is a really fancy way of saying rent that didn't get paid. People who didn't pay their rent are collection losses. But vacancy is also a loss. Does that make sense? So that number gets subtracted. That's our first subtraction. If you notice, there's a very clear pattern here. It's this number minus this number equals this number. Minus this number equals this. Does everybody see that? That's why it's just alternating all the way down. So gross potential minus vacancy and collection losses. So what do we do for now? Another minus or an equals? Equals something called gross effective income, or effective gross. It could be said either way. Gross effective or effective gross. Now it still has that word gross in there. Gross means what as opposed to net? Gross means before we've done what? Before we've taken out expenses. Expenses. Before we've deducted expenses. So we're still before any expenses have been deducted, but now we're not at potential income, we're at effective income. This is the rent that was actually collected. This is the money that actually came in the door, is the gross effective income. Is everybody okay with that? So what do we do for next? Minus or equals? Minus. All right, what if I told you we wanted to change from gross to net? What do you think is going to be minused out here? Expenses, and specifically operating expenses. So think back to that slide we had previously. I'll back up to it here real quickly. All of these things fall in that category as operating expenses. So all of these things would be deducted on this line. Does that make sense for everybody? So like for example, our management fee is a what? It's an operating expense. The property taxes are an operating expense. So this would be where in the formula you would subtract all of those line items. Every single one of those things gets subtracted right here as an operating expense. So this is by far going to be the biggest dent in your number. Does that make sense? Most of the money's coming out right here. Operating expenses is going to be a huge line item on any cash flow report. And that's what this is called, a cash flow report. Now here's the thing. The management fee. It's what? What is that? What kind of expense? It's an operating expense. Okay? And one thing to note on this, and I probably should have given it to you sooner. Everything in this formula is an annual number. Everything in this formula is meant to be an annual number. Do not ever take a monthly number and plug it into this formula. If they give you a monthly number for anything, whether it's monthly taxes or monthly property management fee or monthly rent, what do you do with it instantly? Multiply it by 12, because we want all annualized numbers in this report. Everything with investment properties on an annualized basis. Well, it says our management fee is an example of an operating expense. But talk to me about that management fee. What do we say the most common way to charge a management fee is? Some percentage of what? Of rent actually collected. Look at the numbers we've got up here so far. Which one of these looks like rent actually collected? Gross effective income. So even though the management fee is down here in the operating expenses, it's going to be some percentage of what number? This number right here. Does that make sense for everybody? Come over here and show you guys as well. Even though the management fee is right here as an operating expense, it's going to be some percentage of the gross effective income, because the gross effective income is the rent that's actually collected. Does that make sense for everybody? So let me point this out to you. Nobody in the world cares about this number up here. Gross potential income. Nobody. There ain't a single investor on this planet. There's not a property manager on this planet. Nobody cares about that number. Why not?
Because it's not real.
It's fake. It doesn't exist. But why is it still an important number? It's our starting point. We need somewhere to start subtracting from. Does that make sense? So the only reason we need gross potential income is to have a starting point. This number, gross effective income, only matters to one group of people. And it's not the owner. Who do you think it matters to? Us, the property manager, because we're compensated what? Based on that number. We would never even bother to calculate the gross effective income, except that's where our management fee gets calculated. But here's what I want to point out to you, and this is going to be so important. The management fee is an operating expense. It does not go on the gross effective income line. It goes on the line where you deal with what? Operating expenses. And here's why that's so important. Because they're going to do this to you on a test. They're going to say the property management fee is 8% of the gross effective income. Operating expenses total $324,000. Folks, if operating expenses total $324,000, what is already included in that $324,000? The management fee. Don't calculate it again. You'll be wrong. You got to pay attention to the wording on this stuff. Does that make sense for everybody? You need to know that the management fee is an operating expense. Now that would be different than if they said the management fee was 10% of the gross effective income and additional additional operating expenses were $300,000. Would you add it in then? Absolutely, because those are additional expenses, which is different. Is everybody good so far? All right, so once we've subtracted our operating expenses, we've gone from gross now to what? Net. N-O-I. Net operating income. Now this number is important to appraisers. It's not important to owners. It's not important to us as real estate brokers. It's important to appraisers. What do appraisers do? What's their job? Determine the value of a property. So why do you think net operating income is important then? What is it going to be used for? Determine the what? The value of the property. How much you pay for the property, how much it's worth, is going to be based on its what? Net operating income. So I'm trying to give you along the way why these numbers exist. This number up here, why does it exist? We need a starting point. This number here, why does it exist? We need to figure out the property management fee. This number right here, why does it exist? For appraisal purposes. And this number down here at the bottom, why does it exist? That's the number who cares about? The owner of the property. That's their number. Because we got one last expense that has to be subtracted out after we get the net operating income. What's that last one? Debt service, the mortgage payment. So net operating income minus the mortgage payment is going to give us what we call before tax cash flow. The before tax part is before income taxes are paid. That's the one thing we don't do for our investor clients. We don't do their income taxes for them. Do we handle all these other expenses? Yes. Based on this chart. Now remember, this report, this is the report I'm giving to the owner at the end of the year. So what do you think also accompanies this report? Maybe next year's estimate, but what else? How about a check? Who collected all the money? It wasn't the owner. Who collected all this money? The property manager. Who paid the property taxes? Who paid the maintenance fees? Who paid the management fee? Who paid all of that stuff? The property manager did. Who paid the mortgage payment? No, ma'am. The property manager. Folks, what comes with this report? A check. For how much money? The before tax cash flow. Everything else has already been what? Taken care of. Yes.
Okay, so in this case, the owner is paid once a year.
That's not necessarily true, whatever the property management agreement says.
Okay, so they could be being paid like monthly.
Monthly or quarterly.
And then, so then they would receive, what, just an itemization of the year?
Whatever, up to that point, year to date. Year to date numbers. That's exactly right. Yes, ma'am.
It's lucrative being a property manager as opposed to selling houses.
Is it lucrative? Okay, I have a commercial development for you that I'd like you to manage that generates an annual gross effective income of about $3.8 million. And right now we're paying an 8% management fee. Would you be interested in that? Okay, there you go. There you go.
Calculators going on.
There you go. So she can do that math. She didn't panic about that. Right?
Touche.
I mean, it's a $300,000 property management fee, thereabouts, roughly, right? So yeah, it can be exceptionally lucrative. It can also drive you absolutely batshit crazy, especially on the residential side. Generally speaking, profitability on the residential side for property management is somewhere, when I say profitability, I mean this is all you're doing for a living and you don't have to do anything else. About 100 units. About 100. Now you think of 100 sets of tenants. That is a large responsibility. That is a large responsibility. So it is something that can be very lucrative, but it is not something that is lucrative in small numbers. Generally speaking, you're making such a small amount on any one unit that you have to manage quite a few units in order to make it lucrative. Unless one of them happens to be, you know, 100,000 square foot commercial space that rents for some astronomical amount by itself. But then there'd be lots of other concerns just maintaining that one space. Okay? Everybody good with this? You've got to memorize this formula because that's what the math's going to be all about in this section. Now, as far as calculating the management fee itself, that's pretty simple math. You got a T-bar for it. It's just like any other commission, except in this case, you're not multiplying a sales price times the management fee or times the rate. You're multiplying what times the rate? What's the basis for the property management fee? Gross effective income. So it's gross effective income times the rate is going to give us the management fee. And I'm going to finish up the slides and we'll come back and we're going to work on plenty of math examples with these. So far, are we all okay? All right? So, some things that we should look at when we're determining our rental things. This is one of those topics they like to ask on the test. What items should a property manager consider when they're setting their rental rates? Well, there's no one right answer. There's 4 right answers. There's 4 things that a property manager should weigh. And all of them are important. Number 1, first and foremost, you've got to charge enough rent to cover your operating expenses. Hopefully that's self-explanatory, right? We do not want to have negative net operating income. If we have a negative net operating income, clearly something is going wrong with the management of the property. So we have to charge enough rent to at least cover our operating expenses. Then we need to cover additionally enough to pay for any debt service and to create a return on the owner's investment. Does that make sense? Now, you're not setting these rental rates in a vacuum. What I mean by that is you can't just decide, oh, we're going to charge $1,400 a month in rent. What do you think you have to look at?
The operating expenses.
Not only the operating expenses, but that still has, that's only a piece of the puzzle. What else do you have to look at? What are your tenants going to be looking at? The market, comparables. They're going to be looking at other things. You cannot, your clients are going to be one-sided enough for everybody. They don't need your help with that. They don't need your help seeing their side. I need this much money. Nobody gives a crap. Nobody except you. The market does not care how much money somebody needs. Would y'all agree with that? What does the market care about? What it will generate. The market cares about what it will generate. And what I mean by that is you've got to look at your competition. You've got to weigh out what are other competing properties renting for. That should always be part of the consideration for any sort of operating budget. And then this last one, vacancy rates. Do you think it's important to watch your vacancy closely? Yes. I'm going to ask you an unfair question. What should your goal be as far as vacancy goes? The natural answer seems to be 0. That's wrong. That's wrong. Because if you have 0 vacancy, I can 100% assure you you're not charging enough. Now we're not, again, you can't look at this over small numbers. If you're managing 8 properties, we probably do want you to have 0 vacancy because even 1 would be a huge chunk of your total inventory. Does that make sense? But if you're managing 100 units, 100% vacancy would not be what you'd want. Because what that means is you're not charging those 100 people enough. Which would you rather have? Charge $1,000 a month for your 100 units and have all of them occupied, or charge $1,100 a month and that causes you to drop down to 90% occupancy, so you lose 10% of that. You do the math on your calculator. What comes out to be better? 90 units rented at $1,100 a month, or 100 units rented at $1,000 a month? You know,
Even if it's the same money, you're doing less work.
and there's a great point. Even if the money works out evenly, there's multiple things at play here. You're doing less work. It's less strain on the property because you always have 10% of your units what? Vacant, able to do maintenance on them. If you have 100% occupancy, is maintenance going to slide? Yeah, because it's very hard to work on them when they're occupied. It's very hard to do that work. People don't want you coming in their house. They don't want you in there unless something's what? Broken. Then they want you in there right then. They don't want you to come in and change a filter, but if the air conditioner dies, they want you to pull one out of your rear end in 3 hours. It's just the truth. It's the way this works. So having vacancy is a good thing. If your vacancy numbers or occupancy numbers get too high, it probably means you need to reevaluate what your rental levels are, what your rent rate is, because you're probably not charging enough. You want to have some vacancy to allow for maintenance, to allow for flexibility. Here's the thing, if I'm running at 90% occupancy and I get a group of 4 that comes in and wants to rent 4 units, can I accommodate them? Sure I can, because I got 10 units vacant. If I'm running at 100%, and by the way, all those 4 that are coming in are paying that higher rental rate, aren't they? If I got 100% occupancy, can I accommodate those 4 that come in? Not only that, not only can I accommodate those 4 coming in, when somebody moves out, am I going to have downtime? I don't have to have downtime if I've got vacancy all the time, because as soon as somebody else wants to come in, they can go into a different unit than this person's coming out of. And I've got planned time to get it turned. Does that make sense for everybody? So vacancy is a big consideration for a property manager. Other things that go into, or things that a property manager would be responsible for, so you might have to identify these on the test. Marketing the property, so getting it out there, doing the advertising, choosing the tenants, probably the single hardest part of the job of a property manager, particularly a residential property manager, is choosing the tenants. Because folks, we haven't talked about fair housing laws yet, but it is so easy to run afoul of fair housing laws if you are not exceptionally careful with your practices and how you apply them as a residential property manager. I'll just give you an example. Years ago, when I was doing residential property management, and this was when Skype and video conferencing were all fairly new things, I had a property owner in New Jersey, house here in Raleigh, and we had marketed the house, and I had some tenants who had applied and had done their background checks, had done, criminal history check, they had paid deposit, filled out application, everything looked good. And I was ready to approve them, and I contacted the landlord and I said, okay, I'm going to approve these folks, they're going to move in the beginning of next month. And the landlord said, well, just one question for you, before you sign off on it, I'd like to talk with them. And I said, why? Number one, that's my job, right? And she said, well, I don't really mean talk to them. She said, actually, what I'd like to do, if you could set it up, is I'd like to do a video Skype with them. No. Absolutely freaking not. Folks, what can somebody tell in a video that they can't tell on an application? What possible good could come from a landlord seeing video of, how do I know what they're looking for in that video? I don't. Nor was I going to find out, because I wasn't going to let them see one. Does that make sense? So you have to learn to be very stern with the property owner, because the property owners, quite honestly, don't care about fair housing laws. They don't care about you getting in trouble for fair housing. They want what they want. You're going to have a property owner that will say to you, I don't want any kids in my house. That's a fair housing violation right there. Boom. And if you participate in that, that's a $5,000 fine to you personally. Not from the real estate commission, because they can't what? They can't fine you, but a fair housing board can. The North Carolina Human Rights Commission can. And they will. And they absolutely will. So you're going to have to learn how to be stern. Choosing the tenants is one of the hardest things to be responsible for, particularly as a residential property manager. What I would say to you about this is, once you become a property manager and you're in charge of choosing tenants, selecting tenants, you want very clear written criteria. Do not go into this thing blindly and think, well, we're just going to choose the best tenant. That is a bad way to go. Because though you may have a completely well-meaning definition of best in their mind, could that definition get perverted some way? Could they make assumptions about why you chose them or why you didn't choose them? People get upset when they don't get a property. Are you following me? And so you have to be exceptionally careful. And so what I would tell you is, have written policies that are very clear about who is accepted and who is not. And they should all be based around what kind of criteria? What do you think?
Qualification.
Qualifications, like financial qualifications, right? Credit, rental history, criminal history, all of those things. Can you apply those evenly to everybody? Absolutely you can. And here's the other thing I would recommend. And a lot of them say you have to do this, but if you want to stay out of fair housing jail, this is the best way to do it. Process one application at a time. And when you get somebody who's acceptable, what do? You accept them. The biggest danger you have as a residential property manager is taking 5 applications and processing all 5 of them. Because what if all 5 of them meet your criteria? Now what do you have to do? You got to pick. And I don't want to be in that process of picking. So my rule of thumb was always, we would process these applications in the order they came in, and as soon as we got a tenant who matched our criteria, that is who we accepted. Does that make sense? As an even way. And you're going to have to understand that that's not going to be what the property owner wants to hear. Because they want to pick and choose. What you need to explain is you can't do that as a real estate broker because of the presence of fair housing rules. Now, if you're in commercial real estate, can you do whatever the heck you want to do? Fair what? Housing. Fair housing. None of those rules apply in commercial real estate. So you don't have nearly that problem in commercial real estate. You can get a good feeling, bad feeling, whatever kind of feeling you want, because there's not the 800-pound proverbial gorilla about to bounce you on the head with fair housing. I have seen so many people go down the wrong road with those laws because they either don't understand them or they're just too stubborn to understand them. So be very careful with the tenant selection part of the thing. And that's the only thing that's fair to the tenants as well. Collecting the rent, huge part of property management. If collecting rent was easy, you would have never been hired in the first place. That's really what it boils down to. Most people who hire property managers have already tried to do it on their own. And they hired you because they were having a hard time doing what? Collecting the rent. They didn't want to hear the sob stories because it made them feel bad. It doesn't make them feel bad to pretend these people are not people, and that's what they have you for. Because once they've hired you, guess what those tenants have become to the owner? Dollar signs. That's it. And so you have to deal with the sob stories. This is why I don't do residential property management anymore. I am too much of a softie, believe it or not. This stuff tears me out of my frame. Because if you go into residential property management, you will hear it all. And at least 25% of it is true, which is bad. And I don't mean it's bad that only 25% of it is true. I mean, it's shocking that even 25% of some of the horror stories you hear are true. Now, 75% of it is completely made up. I had one tenant whose mama died 3 times in 3 years. Every time her rent was like, oh, I'm sorry, my mom passed away last month, and I've been dealing with all that. I finally said, how many mamas do you have? It's number 3 as far as I can tell. So you will get, and so here's always been my way, when somebody asks me if they should go into residential property management, here's my canned answer, and this is what I tell them. I say, now we're not supposed to talk about families with children because it's a protected class, but for right now I'm going to talk about it because I'm going to say this. If you ask yourself this question, could I throw a single mom with 3 kids out on Christmas Day?
No.
And the answer to that question is no, then you're not a residential property manager. If the answer to that question is, has she paid rent? Then you're a residential property manager. Because that's what it takes. And you have to know yourself. Because if you the least little bit soft, they will run you over. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I'm in residential property management, but when we're talking about, because I don't know really much about commercial in that sense.
Yep.
So when you were talking about how in commercial real estate, fair housing doesn't apply.
Correct.
So I take a redlining, blockbusting, and steering don't apply in commercial?
Those are all residential terms. Those are all fair housing terms. That is correct. So that basically means in commercial real estate, it is fair game to talk about any of those protected classes that you cannot talk about in residential real estate. It is fair game to talk about race, color, religion, ethnicity, familial status, handicapping status.
Is there a reason why for that? I mean, that's
Just because the laws only apply to residential properties. They're called the fair housing statutes. I mean, it's not like they wrote them and said, we want you to be able to discriminate in commercial property. It's just that the statutes were written specifically to target, residential properties, and they've just never been applied to commercial settings. And the truth is, much commercial development could never get done if you had those kinds of restrictions on it. So let me give you an example of what I mean. As a residential broker, and I don't want to go too far down the fair housing rabbit hole here, but as a residential broker, you could never, for example, talk about the race of someone who is looking at purchasing a home. Does that make sense for everybody? It's a protected class, you simply can't talk about it. But as a commercial developer, if you're building a shopping center in the area, is race, ethnicity, national origin going to dictate the mix of tenants that you have in that shopping center? If you don't think so, then you are naive. Of course it does. And of course, every commercial property developer looks at those things. They look at demographics. There's that word that gets thrown out there. They want to know what the age is of the people that live nearby, what the race is of the people that live nearby, how many children they have in their household, what the average income is, what religion they are, what ethnicity they are. All of that goes into discussions about commercial development. We would love to think those things should not matter, but in the commercial world they certainly do, especially when you start looking at things like tenant mix, and what tenants would be a good fit in a particular property. They look at all those kinds of demographic information, so it's very different on the commercial side. Yes?
It makes sense that it would be more for advertising purposes and not for like exclude. They're not trying to exclude certain races and religions and stuff, but they're trying to see what, type of advertising or what kind of businesses would work in certain.
Well, yeah, I get what you're saying, but intent doesn't matter when it comes to fair housing.
No,
Literally in this case,
commercial, yeah.
but I get what you're saying. My point though is, that's not why it's segregated off. It's segregated off just because it's commercial, because it's not housing, period.
Right.
And so the reason I have to shut down that line of thinking is, when we get to fair housing, you'll start to apply that same line of thinking, oh, I'm not trying to discriminate, I'm talking about it because they want to live near people that look like them. It's still discrimination, right? So it's a very bright line on the ground. If it's residential, you can't talk about those things. If it's commercial, you can. Okay? Maintaining the property, performing all the landlord's duties, like going to court, for example. That would be the property manager's responsibility. And then definitely doing the record keeping, the accounting, showing how the money is going in and out. For test taking purposes, you should know the difference between preventative maintenance and corrective maintenance. Which one of these do you think is more cost effective long term? Preventative maintenance. Preventative maintenance is always more cost effective than corrective. Corrective is fixing something after it's already broken. Preventative is maintaining it with the hopes that it will not become broken. So as a property manager, what type of maintenance should you focus on? Preventative. Now, this also needs to happen in conjunction with a conversation with the landlord. This is where it goes back to what their goals are with the property. What if they're going to tear the thing down at the end of this year and redevelop it? Are you going to be focused on preventative maintenance? What does everything shift to at that point? Corrective, right? And probably a lot of deferred maintenance, which means delayed or never done. Because if they're going to tear the property down, preventative maintenance doesn't matter any longer. And that would happen. Sometimes you get commercial properties that are going to be redeveloped. You know, right now, maybe they're, like this hotel right here. Let's say the owner of this hotel is going to sell that, and it's going to be redeveloped as condominiums. Well, if you are the property manager of that hotel over there, and you know that it's going to be redeveloped as condominiums at the end of this calendar year, and the air conditioning goes out in one of those rooms, are you going to put a new one in there, or are you going to put a $500 Band-Aid on that one? You're going to put the $500 Band-Aid. You're not going to worry about trying to prolong the life of the property because you know that that's going to end. So much of the maintenance decision is dictated based on the goals of the property owner as well. And then this last little note, what can a non-licensed and unlicensed person do in the property management world? Because we already said that to be the property manager, you had to have a license, and it had to be what kind of a license? Active, but also what? Non-provisional. But can an unlicensed person do a lot of these functions? And the answer is yes. In fact, an unlicensed person can do most of the functions of property management. They can collect rent, they can make deposits into the trust account, they can even balance the trust account, they can write checks out of the trust account, they can schedule maintenance. What they can't do is negotiate. An unlicensed person can't negotiate. So if a tenant comes in and they want to talk about renewing their lease, who does that conversation need to happen with? The property manager, not an unlicensed person. If the tenant wants to come in and talk about maintenance they need, can they have that conversation with the unlicensed person? Yes, absolutely. What else can they not do? They can show property that is for what? Rent or lease, but never property that is for sale. Okay? Good. Good. They can show property for lease, but never for sale. And they can't do any sort of solicitation. They can't try to generate business. Now, they can do marketing, like marketing for the property, but what they can't do is go out and try to solicit other property management business, because that is a negotiation. Yeah. Correct. So a provisional broker could do any of these things because they're working on behalf of the non-provisional property manager. So basically, a provisional broker can do the exact same things that an unlicensed person can do when it comes to property management. But they can't be the property manager. But remember, the only thing that's required to get rid of the provisional status is to do what? Take the post-licensing classes. Once you've wiped out the post-licensing classes, provisional status goes away. Yes, ma'am.
So since you remember that seller can never negotiate anything for sale.
Can never negotiate, period. Can't show anything for sale, but you can't negotiate anything, period, as an unlicensed person. Are you a salaried employee of the property owner? Then you're exempt. Then you're exempt. As a salaried employee, W-2, salaried employee of the property owner. Remember, that's one of those big exemptions that we talked about in the license law. So these are people who are salaried employees of brokers, not of the property owner. So a salaried employee of a broker cannot negotiate. A salaried employee of the property owner can. And if you think about it, the reason is there's one less degree of separation there, right? If you're the salaried employee of the property owner themselves, then who do you answer to? The property owner. If you're the salaried employee of the property manager, then who do you answer to? You answer to the broker, and in turn the broker answers to who? The property owner. The concern there is something's going to get lost in translation. It's too far apart. Does that make sense? No, right. They don't want a middleman. right? So if you're the salaried employee of the owner of the property, then you're free to negotiate on their behalf. But if you're the salaried employee of the broker who represents the property, no negotiation. A little bit of a difference there. And remember, that also is true for the showing property that's for sale. A salaried employee of the property owner can show property that's for sale, like an on-site salesperson who's not licensed. They can do that. But not a salaried employee of a broker cannot show property that's for sale.
There's a similar test question.
There will definitely be test questions like that. There will definitely be test questions about those exemptions to needing them. Remember, I said they're not going to test you on what you need a license for. They're going to test you on the exemptions to needing a license. Okay? And then the last thing in the property management section here, we deal with the Fair Housing Act. Later on, there's a whole chapter about fair housing. But one thing that makes sense to make note of right now, since we're talking about property management, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, generally speaking, if you're managing residential property, you don't have to worry about the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the Americans with Disabilities Act does not apply to residential properties. What laws apply to residential properties? Fair housing. The Americans with Disabilities Act picks up where fair housing drops off. So what kinds of properties are covered here? The vast majority of commercial property. Now, there are some commercial properties that wouldn't fall under this, but not many. Because the definition here is the Americans with Disabilities Act covers any place of public accommodation. So any place that's open to who? The public, for any reason, falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act says that any place of public accommodation has to provide equal access without regard to disability. Whether that disability be physical or mental, you have to provide equal levels of access without regard to disability. Now, two words that you need to familiarize yourself with: an accommodation or a modification. These are both methods of providing access. They both deal with giving access to someone who does not ordinarily have access. But they are very different, because one is giving access through changing the way you operate, and the other is giving access through changing the property itself. An accommodation is changing the way you operate. So, for example, let's say consistently we had more people with handicap parking placards than there were handicap parking spaces marked in front of the suite out there. Would that be most likely handled with an accommodation or a modification? Oh, really? I'm going to build another parking lot somewhere? I don't need to add more spaces. What do I need to do?
These are all handicap right here.
That's right. You just change the way you operate. You simply flag additional spaces as what? As handicap. That is not a modification. That is an accommodation. That's an accommodation. If, for some reason, I was operating a property and we had to install an elevator to provide access, is that an accommodation or is that a modification? That is clearly a modification. If we need to install a ramp, is that an accommodation or a modification? Modification. If my leasing office is upstairs, and monthly when my tenant who is wheelchair bound comes to pay their rent, so I come downstairs to meet them to collect the rent, is that an accommodation or a modification? That's an accommodation. You see the difference there? The Americans with Disabilities Act does not say which one you have to do. It simply says you have to do one, the other, or some combination in order to provide equal access in places of public accommodation. Everybody okay with that? The last thing I'm going to touch on here in the Americans with Disabilities Act is the rules regarding service animals. Okay? First of all, you don't get to define a service animal. It's not your job. It's not my job. In fact, it's nobody's job. There is no real definition of a service animal. There is no certification process. There is no class. There is no certificate. A service animal is one that provides assistance to someone with a disability. Is everybody good on that definition? A service animal is one that provides assistance to someone with a disability. Now, we do know in the case of the Americans with Disabilities Act what species those can be. Because the Americans with Disabilities Act does say that only certain species can be service animals. Those are dogs and miniature horses.
Service sharks for
No. No peacocks either. That's why it was okay for that peacock to be kicked off the airplane a couple months ago. I don't know if y'all saw that. Lady showed up with her peacock, said it was her emotional support animal. They showed him sitting on top of the luggage, sitting in the airport waiting to get on the plane, you know.
Would you rather have a peacock or a miniature horse on your plane?
A miniature horse, man, that'd be the coolest thing ever, you know. I'd love a miniature horse on the plane with me. But entertain me the whole trip. There's a lady in Chapel Hill that has one. He's the most awesome thing I've ever seen. He wears Jordans. He has his own Jordans that he wears everywhere. He rides the bus with her. He rides the van with her. So if you're ever driving to Chapel Hill and you drive by a Chapel Hill Transit van and you see a horse sitting in the front seat, that's him, you know.
You have the word adequate accommodation. Is that remain just for that part of the American Disabilities Act?
Yes.
Because on the employer side, we use the word reasonable.
Yeah, it is a little bit different on the property management side. It is a little slightly different. Just FYI, the reason miniature horses are, people always say, why miniature horse? Miniature horses perform a lot of the same functions that dogs do, particularly for vision impairment, and they are particularly good with mobility, stability issues, people that can walk but need help walking, people that have problems with falling, for example. They can fit the miniature horse with a harness so that the person can lean on them all the time, and they also can be trained so that if the person falls, they come and get beside them so that they can lean on the horse and push up to help them. I mean, they're really amazing animals and how helpful they are. The big thing with miniature horses, though, is their lifespan. If you think about, for example, a seeing eye dog, the working lifespan of a seeing eye dog is between 8 and 9 years. That's their working lifespan. The working lifespan of a miniature horse is 25 years. So those people don't have to rebond with a new animal nearly as often, which you can imagine is tremendous benefit to them. There's huge waiting lists for miniature horses, by the way. If you have somebody who has a disability who wants a miniature horse, last I heard it's like a 4-year wait to get one. Because there's not enough breeders that breed them and train them for the demand. Yes?
I have a quick question. So someone at our property wants to get a service animal,
Yeah.
okay? We know if he has a
Now, this is a residential property, right?
Mhm.
So that's going to be fair housing law, not Americans with
Right.
Disabilities Act.
Okay, so with this said, the service animal is,
Doesn't matter what it is.
okay,
Because under fair housing, there's no species restriction.
but it's still, wait, I'm confused.
Yeah, completely different law.
Okay.
So under fair housing, service bat, service cat, service rat, service
Oh.
snake, service...
Oh, okay.
There is no species restriction under the fair housing rules.
Even the size.
There is no restriction, no restriction under the fair housing rule. Right. The Americans with Disabilities Act specifies dog or miniature horse. So if you're running a restaurant, for example, and somebody shows up with a cat and says that is their service animal, do you have to accommodate the cat? You do not, because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, a cat is not defined as a service animal. Does that make sense? Now, let's get back to that definition part. There are 2 questions you are permitted to ask, and that is it. These are the only 2 questions you're permitted to ask when it comes to challenging someone who shows up or claims to have a service animal, okay? Number 1, do you have a disability? Now, did I ask what the disability was?
No.
Did I say prove it? Did I say stand on one leg or hop around? No. Do you have a disability? That's it. If they answer yes to that question, you can't ask for verification, you can't ask what the disability is, you cannot pry any further. If they say yes to have a disability, then you follow up with the next question, which is the animal trained to provide you assistance with that disability? Now notice again, I can't ask what the animal is trained to do, where the animal was trained, how it was trained, do you have some certificate or nameplate or anything else. It's simply, is the animal trained to provide assistance with that disability? If they answer yes to both of those questions, then under federal law, that is a service animal. Okay. You may not like that definition. That definition is certainly abused on regular occasion, but that is the definition, at least until the United States Congress decides to do something about it. Good luck with that. Yes, ma'am. Well, and that's why, generally speaking, if someone shows up with an animal that claims it to be a service animal, that's as far as I'm going. Because you're opening yourself up to greater scrutiny by challenging that. And that's why you see, and you've probably noticed this, with increasing regularity, stores and that sort of thing have just gone to a well-behaved pets allowed policy. Because so many people were proclaiming their pets were service animals, and then the door greeters were getting into fights with people at the door about, is this a service animal? And then Walmart's getting sued because somebody couldn't bring their service schnauzer into Walmart, you know. And so they've just decided it's cleaner to just have a well-behaved pets policy. Because what the Americans with Disabilities Act does not do is say you have to accommodate an unruly animal. If the animal is not well-behaved, then you can absolutely make the animal and its owner leave the premises. If the animal is not, you know, if it's jumping on people or, you know, or causing headaches or barking or, you know, any of those things, you know, you can certainly, that they cease to be a service animal and they become a public nuisance like that. Yes?
Okay. Because I deal with service animals and emotional support animals all the time. So for instance, if you're on a plane and you are able to take your emotional support animal, obviously I know there are two different things, emotional support and service.
No, not under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A service animal is a service animal is a service animal.
No, I know that. And an emotional support animal is no.
Is a service animal.
But what if, okay, this is just kind of, it blows my mind because a dog ended up biting someone that was an emotional support. Because remember, you said service animals, you have a disability, and is the animal trained to provide assistance. For a service animal, yes, but an emotional support animal, people get away with it and say, this is my emotional support animal, and they have documentation from the doctor. But
again, an emotional support animal is a meaningless terminology when it comes to these laws. You're inventing that terminology.
Okay.
They are either a service animal, in which case somebody's answered yes to those two questions, or they're a pet. Those are the only two options. So if somebody says, this is my emotional support animal, I'm going to go back and say, do you have a disability? Is the animal trained to provide assistance with that? Because if they answer yes to both, then it's a service animal.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
So you're separating these, with the ADA is for commercial.
Mm-hmm.
Commercial meaning this building.
Pretty much anything not residential.
Not residential. And then residential meaning anything that you're leasing, vacation, or regular property that you're leasing, correct?
To live in.
So that's your fair housing.
Correct.
So the difference in the two for the service animal would be
The breed restriction.
the breed restriction.
The species restriction. Breed restriction is a bad way to put it. Species restriction. The Fair Housing Act, when it was written, and admittedly, even the people who wrote the Fair Housing Statutes have admitted many times over the years that they never intended, they intended to mimic the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was in existence prior to the Fair Housing Act. But the Americans with Disabilities Act specified breeds, species. The Fair Housing Act never did. It simply said service or assistance animals. And the interpretation over the years has been that since it's not specific to, then it's not specific to anything. So there have certainly been people that have made claims in fair housing that they have a service snake, for example. Don't bring it around me. It'll be served, but not. But that's fair housing, which is, you know, so you just have to know which rule you're working with and how to apply which rule. So, for example, if you are a property manager who's managing an apartment complex, you may have to deal with both. Because your offices, your common areas, your swimming pool, your amenities are going to be subject to which one of these laws?
Disability.
The Americans with Disabilities Act. The units themselves are going to be subject to the Fair Housing Act. So somebody could show up, for example, at your office with a service iguana. And you could tell them you can't bring that in the office. But then you would have to rent them the apartment and allow them to have it in the apartment. Because, you know, it is considered a service animal in one place but not in the other because of the two different laws. The joys of property management. Okay, are we good on that?
I didn't know
Okay, good. All right, so now what we want to do is take a look at the math here. So I want everybody to take out that worksheet that I passed out this morning. Right there. It says property management net operating income before tax cash flow math worksheet.
Oh, yeah, I know that. What's the second letter?
All right. So on these questions, number one, it says calculate the gross potential income for a property with 18 commercial units that each rent for $1,250 a month. So talk to me about gross potential income. What is gross potential income? Go back and look at your form. I'll throw it up here for a second. It's a fantasy amount, I heard that. It's the amount that we might collect, right? Maximum potential income. So how would we calculate the gross potential income for a property with 18 units that each rent for $1,250 a month? It would be $1,250 times what? Times 12. Why? Because everything needs to be annualized, and that's a monthly rent, right? And then times what? 18 units. So $1,250 times 12 times 18, $270,000. How's that for everybody? So $270,000 for a gross potential income on that property. Does that make sense? Anybody confused by that? Now number two wants us to calculate the effective gross income of the same property if 15% of the rent is not what? Not collected. If 15% of the rent is not collected due to vacancy or non-payment collection losses, what is the effective gross income? So this is where I want you to get into the habit, and I know it's going to seem tedious, of writing down the whole formula. Because the more you write the whole formula, the more likely you are to get it memorized sooner. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. So what does the formula start with? What's at the top of the formula? Gross potential income. And I always write it down the middle of my sheet here, and I'll show you why as we do these, because what I do is I make notes on the right and then do the math on the left. But you can do it however you want to. What comes next? Minus vacancy, right? Equals what? Gross effective income. What's next? Minus what? Operating expenses. And what does that equal?
Net operating.
Equals net operating income. And then what's our last subtraction?
Debt service.
Minus the debt service or mortgage payment. And that equals what? Before tax cash flow. Alright? Here's why I like to write the whole thing out. First thing I'm going to do is circle what they want. How far I need to go in the formula. Where are they asking me to go here? They want to know what? The gross effective income. So I'm going right here. There's my destination. And here's what I know. I know the gross potential income is how much? $270,000. And the reason I know that's because it's the answer to question number one, right? What do they want me to do? Subtract 15%. So I just put that in my notes over there. Can I calculate 15% of $270,000? So times 15% looks like $40,500 in vacancy to me. And that would give me a gross effective income of $229,500. Does that sound about right?
You got the 50% of the $270,000, that brings us to $40,500. Then we got I got lost, when you got the 229.
270.
The 270 from the 40.
Look at the formula. Gross potential minus vacancy equals gross effective, right? Just follow the formula. So what's our gross effective income here? 229.5, right? Is that okay with that? All right, then look at number 3. Number 3 wants us to calculate the annual property management fee for the property in questions 1 and 2, assuming the brokerage, get out of there, handling the property management account is charging a 10% management fee. So, talk to me about a property management fee. It's an operating expense, no question. It's calculated based on the gross effective income. Well, isn't that what we just came up with in the previous question? So we know that the gross effective income equals $229,500, correct? Everybody good with that? And the management fee is going to be 10% of that. So can we just multiply that number times 10%? And that looks like $22,950 to me.
So, when I first looked at that question, maybe if you were kind of open it to, you would estimate it from the corporate world, it's $27,000. So you would get, if they charge 10%, they would have $27,000.
No, because you're going to also estimate your vacancy. You would also, if you were doing an operating budget, you would. The question was, if I was doing this as an operating budget at the beginning of the year, would I estimate that I was going to make a $27,000 property management fee? And the answer is no, because I would estimate some vacancy. Yeah. Okay. Are we all good on our property management fee here being $22,950? Yes.
So, because it says on questions 1 and 2, like you said, you're estimating your vacancy. You're assuming your vacancy is that percentage we took out.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. On a test, they're never going to give you this building of questions. What do you think the question's going to be on the test? It's going to be the last one. It's going to be all of it together. It's, you know, on a test, the question would be, you have a property that has 18 commercial units that each rent for $1,250 a month, and 15% of the rent is not collected due to vacancy and collection losses. If you're charging a 10% property management fee, how much is your property management fee? It would all be one compartmentalized question, and you'd have to do the steps. That's why I say you get used to writing the formula out. Okay? All right, number 4 is that question. So number 4 says, take all of that and put it together and tell us what you come up with. Calculate the annual property management fee for a 20-unit apartment building where the units rent for $800 monthly and the property has a 10% vacancy rate while the property manager is charging an 8% management fee. First thing, and I'm telling you, if you don't do it this way, you will miss these questions on the exam. I cannot tell you in any more explicit way. I realize your tendency is to go off to the races with a calculator. No, just stop. What is going to be the first thing we're going to write out here? That big long formula. Because what you're going to recognize is in these questions they start to get more and more detailed. You get more and more bits of information, and you can't keep it all in your brain. You can't keep it all aligned. You need to make notes for yourself and write out the full formula. So where does the formula start? Let's write it out again. Gross potential minus what? And what does that equal? That equals effective gross or gross effective, right? And minus what? Operating expenses. And what do we get next? What happened there? What happened? All right, let me go back here. Since my computer decided it'd be fun to just start over. All right, so gross potential minus vacancy equals gross effective, right? Or effective gross, either one, minus operating expenses. And what does that equal now? NOI. And NOI minus debt finally equals what? Before tax cash flow. So now I'm just going to start making notes for myself. I'm not going to do any math. That's going to be the key to getting these things right. Make notes for yourself and then come back and do the math all at the end. Okay? So you get things on the correct lines. Calculate the annual property management fee for a 20-unit building. Okay? So right there I've got information. A 20-unit building. What line is that going to go on? 20 units. Gross potential income. So over here on the right of that, I'm just going to put 20 times 800 times what? 12, because it's monthly rent. Does that make sense for everybody? I'm not going to pick up the calculator. I'm not going to do the math. I know that's what you want to do so bad. Don't. Because when you do that, you completely lose your train of thought of where you are in that string of information up there. Does that make sense? Just leave it. You can come back. Now you've got it written out for yourself and do it later. We've got a 10% vacancy rate. I'm not going to do any math yet. I'm just going to write here on the vacancy line what? 10%. While the property manager is charging an 8% management fee. Well, where is the property management fee? What line item is that? It's an operating expense, right? So I'm going to put 8% here in my operating expenses. Now I'm ready to do the math because I've got everything lined up. Does everybody agree with that? Okay, so gross potential income, 20 times 800 times 12. What is my gross potential income? $192,000. Now, vacancy, minus 10% of that, so that's going to be minus $19,200. Is everybody okay with that? And that leaves me with an effective gross income of how much money? $172,800. Are we all okay with that? Does everybody understand where those numbers have come from so far? Good. Now, next step, calculate that management fee. How much did they tell us the management fee was going to be? 8%. So if we were doing the math over here, it would be minus that 8%. Of course, they just want to know what the management fee is. So 172,800 times 8% equals 13,824. And there's your answer for your property management fee. $13,824. We okay there? All right. Now, number 5 wants you to go a step further. Look at what it's asking for. Calculate what? the net operating income. As soon as you see that, what should you think? I need to write down what? This formula, because I'm going to have a lot of information I have to deal with. So I started all over again. Gross potential income minus what? Minus vacancy equals gross effective income minus operating expenses, right? What does that equal? NOI and minus debt service equals before tax cash flow. Now, where are they asking me to end here? Where's my answer? They want to know the what? Calculate the what? NOI. So I would just circle it, highlight it, whatever you want to do. Give yourself a landing spot. Because here's the thing, and here's what you need to understand. These people who write these tests are evil. They are going to give you things that don't matter. Is it possible you think they could give you a debt service payment in this question? Yes. And here's the thing. If you have written the formula out, it won't matter if they give you a debt service payment, because you'll see it's where? It's after where you want to end up. When you get here, you're what? You're done. Stop. That's the whole point of writing it out and then circling where you're headed. So you can ignore anything after that. Is everybody with me on that? I don't know if they do that in this particular question, but they will eventually do it. Okay? So calculate the net operating income of a triplex property. We'll stop right there. Triplex. How many units do I have? 3 units. So what line does that go on? Gross potential income, right? So 3 units times how much a month? $750 times what? Times 12, because that's monthly rent. Is everybody okay on my gross potential income line? Okay? So we've dealt with all of that stuff. Another way you could handle this, could you now mark through that? I mean, because we don't need any of this anymore, right? Aren't we done with all that? Okay? And a 10% annual collection loss. So what line is that going on? Vacancy. So I'm just going to make a note for myself, 10%. Again, I'm not doing the math yet. All right, I can mark through that. That is managed by a broker property manager who charges a 10% management fee. Now that 10% management fee is what? That's an operating expense. So I'm going to put 10% on the operating expense line. So I can get rid of all of that. Done with that. This property has annual repair costs of $800 per unit. Now, repair costs, what line does that go on? That's an operating expense, so that's going to be 800 times what? Times 3, because it's annual 800 times 3 units. Because there are 3 units. Does everybody see that? Okay, so I've dealt with that now. And annual property taxes on the triplex of $5,600. What line does that go on? Operating expenses. Property taxes are an operating expense. Everybody okay with that? So we've got everything aligned where it needs to be. Now we're ready to do our math. So top line, 3 times 750 times 12. $27,000. Does that sound about right for everybody? Okay. So we got gross potential income of $27,000. Now we want to subtract our vacancy of 10%. How much is that? $2,700 coming out for vacancy, which gives me a gross effective income of $24,300. Is everybody okay so far? Yes. $24,300 gross effective. Now, I got a bunch of stuff to subtract out. All these operating expenses, correct? What's the first one you want to deal with? The 10% management fee. So it's 10% of what number? Of $24,300. So minus $2,430, because there's our 10%. All right, what's the next one? Minus what? $2,400, 2,400, because there's our maintenance fee. Oops, I should have written that in green. Sorry. So minus 2,400. And what's the last one? Minus what? Minus $5,600 in property taxes. Once you've done all that, are you ready for your NOI? Absolutely. So 24,300 minus 2430 minus 2,400 minus 5,600. I've got $13,870. Does that sound about right for an NOI for you guys? That is your net operating income for that property. Do you see what I mean about writing the map out for yourself and then circling, this is where I need to end up? Because otherwise you don't know where to stop. You don't know how far to go, you don't know where to stop. Now these have all been pretty straightforward to this point because we've used all the numbers. There are going to be ones where they give you numbers that don't matter. And that's why writing this out becomes so important. Can I explain what? What last part? What are you talking about? Okay. These are my operating expenses, right? I simply brought them over from over here. What's the first operating expense we dealt with? 10% what? What is it? What was it for? Nope. We dealt with it. It's the management fee. So the management fee is 10% of what number? Help her out. 10% of what? Gross effective income. So here's our gross effective. So times 10% will give you that number. That's the first operating expense that comes out, right? And then you've got your maintenance operating expense, which is 800 times 3 units. So there's that $2,400. Then your property taxes are $5,600, which is also an operating expense. It goes over here. So you go all the way down. 24,300 minus all of these operating expenses gives you that net operating income. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes. Some calculators will. Some won't.
Yeah.
Some won't work that way.
It messed me up. It was multiplying.
Yeah. Some will not work that way. That's
when I tried to subtract.
and here's what you have to take a chance at. You're gonna break your calculator on the day of the test, and they're gonna loan you one. It doesn't work that way. That's why I would do the multiply by 10% thing. I wish they all worked that way. It would be great if they did, but they don't.
I don't know why they don't.
I don't either. I don't know why they're not
What
consistent.
is it doing?
Yep, I don't know either. I'm sorry?
I just have wrong in the last one.
What did you do wrong?
I missed
Well,
the step.
you're looking at it right here. How do you not know? Talk to me.
Okay, so I got the gross number of 192,000, and then it's supposed to be 10% of that. I'm on
You
the
got-
previous one. I'm on the previous one.
Well,
I got lost there. I already did the next one. This is the one I had upon, but.
okay.
So I get the 192,000 minus 10%, which is 1920.
19,200.
Oh, that's right. 19,200. So I subtract the 19,200 from the 192,000.
Yeah.
So we just subtract it real quick. So 19, and then I have 172,800.
Correct.
And then from that I get the 8%.
Right.
8%. And I subtract 113.
No. You would be subtracting if you were continuing to go, but what did they ask you for? What did the question ask you for?
To subtract the 8%.
No, it does not ask you. It asks you to calculate what? What is the question asking you for? Calculate what?
The annual, to calculate the annual property management fee for 20.
So I stop. What does it want to know? Don't keep reading. It wants to know what? The what?
The annual property management fee.
So which one of those numbers is the annual property management fee?
The 13,800.
13,824. So then you're not subtracting it. You would be subtracting it if you needed to continue onward, but that's your destination. That's where they want you to stop. They want to know that number. Okay? All right, I want you guys to do number 6. Give you a second to work on it. Well, probably more than a second. Take a look. See if that looks familiar. Where did that come from? 38,950. Property taxes of $38,950 annually. It is asking the NOI. Property taxes are what? Property taxes are an operating expense. So how we do? Some yes, some no. Those of you that are a no, where is it a no? Yes.
I know exactly what we did. We didn't like what it says annual and then monthly, we didn't convert it to 12, like multiply by 12.
Ah. So your vacancy, you didn't multiply times 12?
Yeah.
Monthly vacancy, you gotta convert to what? Annual. The monthly maintenance expense of $3,600 has gotta be multiplied times what? 12. Everything in this formula is annualized, yes. So there's your vacancy, that's your gross effective, okay? So minus your 10% property management. $3,600 monthly maintenance fee. So what should you be doing with that monthly maintenance fee? Times 12. Debt service is not an operating expense. Way down here, right? So that shouldn't be in there. Okay? So you need to multiply that maintenance expense times 12. What should you not have dealt with or counted at all? That debt service payment. Notice I filled it in. I wrote the formula completely out, right? I wrote the formula completely out, and then I highlighted NOI, and then I just drew a line across the page. And what was that line there to tell me? Stop, dummy. You don't need to go any further. You're already at the NOI, so you don't care about what? The debt service. The debt does not matter once you're already at. If they're asking you for the NOI, the debt doesn't matter. Does that make sense for everybody? This is all about writing that formula out and getting everything put in the proper place and paying attention to words like monthly. If you didn't get it, can you look at this and understand exactly where you went wrong? Because if you're at that point, that means you're pretty close to having it nailed down. Because if you can look at this and understand, okay, I get why that didn't happen. Now, as far as the $38,950, property taxes are an operating expense. Remember that. Pretty much the only thing that's not an operating expense, there's about two only things on this thing that aren't operating expenses. The vacancy is the vacancy, and the debt service is the debt service. Everything else is going to be a what? An operating expense. Every other expense that they incur is an operating expense. That's pretty much the best way to look at these things, except vacancy and debt service. Yes?
What throws me off is that your mortgage is not considered operating expense.
Nope.
But the property taxes on the property. So
Sure.
the mortgage, so you gotta pay the property taxes in order to maintain the property, which is considered operating expenses. But you also have to buy the property in order to be able
Pay
to
cash.
operate.
Pay cash.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is the mortgage was necessary.
Pay cash.
No, I can't.
Okay then. Then you don't care about net operating income. What do you care about? Before tax cash flow.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying, you count property taxes as operating expenses. Why aren't you counting a mortgage payment as operating?
Do all properties have property tax?
No.
Yes. Do all properties have mortgages? No. What did I say the net operating income was used to calculate? I just gave it away. For appraisers. If I'm looking at two identical properties that are side by side, that both generate the same amount of income, and one has a mortgage and one does not have a mortgage, should they be valued differently?
Yes.
They should?
No,
Are they
no,
worth
no.
different amounts of money, or are they worth exactly the same amount of money?
The same.
They're worth exactly the same amount of money. The only way they can be worth the same amount of money is if I'm looking at the number before we account for the mortgage payment. That's why net operating income exists. And that's why it specifically leaves out the mortgage payment. The truth is, any owner investor only cares about before tax cash flow. The difference is that somebody who pays cash, their net operating income happens to be the same thing as their before tax cash flow, because that last subtraction is a what? That debt service, what are they subtracting? 0, right? So NOI minus 0 is their before tax cash flow if they don't have any debt on the property. Everybody cares about before tax cash flow. It just so happens that if you pay cash for the property, your net operating income and your before tax cash flow are exactly the same number. Okay? What's tripping you? Because I need to know where you're getting tripped up with these. Yeah? Talk.
I think
That's fine, I get that, for sure.
And then I paid attention to what you said about what are they asking for?
Yep,
And so then I said, okay, I gotta stop there at NOI.
yep.
And so I, because I don't completely understand, didn't go as far as the debt service amount, but I also didn't go at the before tax cash flow.
What do you mean you didn't go
I
before tax cash
I
flow?
thought that those two, since they were after,
They are after. We don't need anything to do with those.
but then you put the 38,000.
No, I did not. Before tax cash flow has nothing to do with property taxes. Just because the word tax is in there does not mean they're related. And I actually explicitly said that earlier. I said what? Before tax means before what kind of taxes? Income taxes. Property taxes are a what? They're an operating expense. That's why it's in there.
I got you.
Just because the word tax is there does not mean leave it out.
I understood.
Yeah. Okay? So make sure you got, it's all about verbiage, because the math, folks, the math, this is about the simplest math in the class, right? It's just multiplication and subtraction. But if you don't get the numbers in the right places, the multiplication and subtraction is going to be wrong. All right, go ahead and do the next one. If you haven't already started on number 7. Look at what they're asking for. Calculate the what? Before tax cash flow. You're going the whole way. Yes, ma'am.
So yeah, I was just doing this, and it says $370,000 monthly. So we really need to multiply that by 12.
What does monthly mean to
I mean,
you?
it's just like, that number is large.
And? You don't like big numbers?
Well, not
If she has a commission over $20,000, will y'all keep the rest because she don't like big numbers?
And then you're gonna keep looking at this saying.
Okay, I agree.
I didn't even look at that, I just working on mine, I'm just
Okay.
I said, I kept trying to find that 38,000.
For sure. Perfect.
That 38,000, I was trying to find that. Which one again? Oh, 7. Yeah, that's what I was on.
Sure. Mm-hmm. 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 Your presentation was wrong. Got it. That's 840 for those. Okay. And those are all, yeah, okay, you did multiple on that. Well, yeah, you're right. So that should be annually.
Okay.
Annually. Thank you.
Would make more sense.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you. Why would you want that?
No, I don't see where it is.
You're not? Do you take?
I thought I did just
Why?
start to work
If
there.
somebody starts you on step 3, do you go backwards to step 1 or do you keep going to step 4?
Now, I guess I just start working, first they got me down to.
And say thank you. Because they started you ahead, right? Yes.
Even one, I'm not gonna give it away.
Sorry?
So then they give away the key, I just has to go.
Good. Good.
Okay, so I want to try. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, okay, it was a big number. Okay, so that's why I need yeah.
You're fine. Everything you're saying is right, by the way, so. I'm listening.
I know you will correct me wrong. Wrong's in your wrong. I love you for that.
But when you're right, I'll tell you you're right. Okay. Yep. Where did you get that? What is that number? 72,000 annually. So like what kind of? That number's right, but this number's wrong, so. you can take a look if you're done with it. I come up with $3,813,720 as a before tax cash flow. So this question is a perfect example of why writing the formula out and knowing the names makes all the difference in the world. Because some of you spent several minutes chasing your tail about a gross potential income. Here's the thing. They gave you the gross effective income, right? If somebody gives you a head start, don't question them, just go with it. All right? It wasn't wrong. They gave you the gross effective, so that's where you start working from. You don't need to know the gross potential. You don't need to know the vacancy because those are behind you, right? We're moving forward. Does that make sense for everybody? So they gave us gross potential of $370,000 a month, so we just multiply that times what? 12, which is a gross effective income of $4,440,000, which Shannon said was too much money. And then we subtracted our operating expenses. Well, here's an answer to Jocelyn's question earlier. Is property management a lucrative business? How much is the property management fee on this property? $399,600 annually. Is that lucrative to you all? Yeah. I'd take a $399,000 property management fee.
Now,
Okay?
would you want to manage all 100 properties all year long?
For 100 properties, I'd probably do that. Yeah, probably so. Okay, is everybody good so far on that? So we got a $399,600 property management fee, and then they gave us $72,000 in annual other operating expenses, right? Now the key thing there was they said annual, so what do we need to do to that number? Nothing. That's why you got to really pay attention to the changes between monthly and annual. If you see monthly, multiply times 12. If you see annually, leave it alone. Is everybody okay with that? And when you subtract those out, that gives you an NOI of $3,968,400. And then the only thing left to subtract is your debt service, which is $12,890 a month times how many months? 12 months, $154,600 a year in debt service, left us with $680. $154,680. I did it as 80 because I got 720 there. Just my penmanship is bad. Sorry. $154,680, which leaves us with a before-tax cash flow of $3,813,720. Are you shaking your head at me?
Because I second guessed myself because I thought the gross effective income was too easy because of the way it was worded.
Right.
And so I second guessed and I corrected it out and
it was. It was. And that's why I just take them at their word when you just start labeling things in. If it says the gross effective income is this, we'll put it on that line. Here's the thing. If they had given you NOI, would you be worried about gross effective? No. If they had given you NOI, all you would have done is NOI minus debt service, and you'd have been at your before-tax cash flow. Yes?
They actually didn't give us enough information to calculate.
Yeah, the other stuff you didn't have enough anyway. Right. Right. But that's a perfect example of making sure you know the formula itself. How do you feel about this so far? Okay. Not too bad. This is I think this is the math that when you first look at it, it looks so intimidating because it's so much information. But if you will just take the time to memorize the formula and then kind of get everything lined up, it's really not so bad. It's really not so bad. And this stuff is going to be involved in probably 4, maybe 5 math questions on the test, because when we get to valuation, we said net operating income was important to who? Appraisers. So when we get to valuation and we teach you how to value income producing property, guess what we're going to do? Pull this formula right back out because we're looking for what? NOI. Okay? And so this is going to be in valuation questions. It's going to be in investment math questions. Here's another way to look at before tax cash flow. That's your investor's return on their investment. That's their annual return. That before tax cash flow, that's how much they're making annually from owning that property and operating it. Not a bad deal if you're on this one. Depending on how much you invested, I suppose, but looks pretty good to me, especially with only, debt service of only $154,000. It looks pretty good. Are we all right with this? Okay, let's do this then. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 4, and then we will look at investment math. For your homework, make sure you finish this section, this packet.
I don't do it well, I won't be a man, but I do it well.
Oh, yeah.
When I managed an apartment complex, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm worried.
At least I haven't done one of my homework problems.
What do you mean the percentage? The percent they got it correct. Percent they got it correct. Are you leaving? No. Okay. All right, so.
I know I got lost right at the end. I ended up doing
No, I'm not reminding you of nothing. You were like when you have a question. First of all, this is not Stop reading what you wrote, because I'm telling you what you wrote wrong. Read what they said. Read that again. Yes. And if it's there, what else? It doesn't matter. You understand? I had it in the right place. Yeah. You were so caught up in needing to start at the top, you just had a little number right there. You gotta put it where it goes.
the other one that he didn't pay. Oh, 16. You making huh? Supposed to be taking a percentage of that check. What you said they give him a check for? That don't even include the other stuff. So, what does he pay for? Supposed to be trying to get this month, right?
So your copies in all of that, is they come in whole bunches for you?
And still don't want to pay me nothing. Right. Even when he got to pay me cash.
Yeah, it doesn't.
After the 840, and he still, don't want to pay me that. Because I quit.
Because he made look at something else. When he make a schedule, so now he only gets cameras because
Half the time, them jackrabbits he's putting over there ain't doing the work they're supposed to be doing. And then he went in the house to them people. You can see it look like a pig. Yeah, you can see it.
$142,000 plus the operating expenses.
And that's why I want to make sure I can stay.
Why I was kind of iffy, but obviously you can't. Why I was like, I was trying to get, I'm doing the situation right now.
I deal with back in the day. Before I retired back in the day, 2000, actually from 93.
Oh, you don't have the. No, but I'm saying. I can see after, okay, I just heard this, we wrong, this is understandable, then I can see like,
Every time, no matter what.
okay, well, and then I talked to my.
Well, with my military pension, I work a full-time job. Because I have lived and I get I can only make a certain amount according to the social security.
And then she was asking what they like, the difficulties, so that's what I was thinking. I want to say, like, what if you take in,
I mean, not to be
Well, he got this girl in here who does nothing. Because you can't hit in our house, she does nothing. Then you have me to come in. And you got my desk stacked up like this when I come in and stuff I got to do. Can't you get her to do something like this? Some of the stuff to do, right? She's talking about what she do.
Is that your commissioner? See, like apartment complex may be getting that, but of course, the people that got in their office only gonna get a little percentage of that, you know what I'm saying? In the office. I
Now,
can't do that
the owners
because
of
one
the-
of my tenant, when my rental house was hit by Hurricane Matthew, or was it Hurricane last 2 years ago, and my tenant told me, the house, the tree fell in your house. I said, like, come on in my house. I let him back to my house and feed him for 3 days.
What did you do? You let them move in with you?
Yeah, my husband told me, you are crazy. I said, wow, they don't know where to go. Unlike, I got all the drama, and I cannot get rental money.
Oh, no, you couldn't.
I
No,
can't.
no.
I'm more, I feed them, it wasn't the boyfriend, and the daughter.
First of all, they need to have rental insurance and they need to go.
Yeah, they should have.
I was taking advantage. Oh my God. After that,
See me? Oh, I could evict that mom that got Christmas and she hadn't paid her rent. I could evict her.
I told my husband, I cannot do this to you. I said, like, let's find a rental management rate for Remax. It's like, we let these people move to our house the same day. 3 days. And she wants me to get her a hotel. And I don't think you have to get a hotel because the rental house is tornado. I can't do this job. I can't do this job.
I've been bankrupt. I'm gonna do I don't like notifications. I like to just open it like, or an app.
I like Caesar salads too, you know what I mean?
We start hanging out with you and you get your food, you just be rapping.
It came with my food. I think it was only like Yeah, I put my order, I did it in the one here. I went over here, put my one, bring my spray on. I did it online.
You said the instant time.
You always in my way. Always.